Stony Brook University in New York. I am Agnes He, Director of MIC. We are deeply honored by the presence of so many colleagues from around the world. As of yesterday, 270 people registered for the event, representing close to 200 institutions from Asia, Africa, as well as North America, Europe, and Australia. Thank you so much for gracing us with your participation. The MIC is an interdisciplinary research center where linguists, applied linguists, psychologists, communication scholars, language education specialists, and scholars of related social science and humanities disciplines come together to explore multilingual repertoires as rich resources in the context of global mobility. So our center is envisioned to be a place where scholars and students from various different disciplines can work collectively to confront the communication challenges of the contemporary multilingual world. It is a place where interdisciplinary thinking is the norm, and interdisciplinary research leads to better understandings of how globalization, immigration, and other events transform our language behaviors and sociocultural practices. So we started with a very simple belief, which is that the power to change the world for the better lies in our very own capacity and commitment to communicate with one another more effectively and more equitably. And to that end, we conduct research on the impact of global mobility on language practices. We examine the languages and lives of multilingual and bilingual speakers and speech communities. We investigate multilingualism for social justice, equity, diversity, and inclusiveness. We build databases on multilingual development. We also inform the public on the means and meanings of developing multilingual and multicultural repertoires. And this year, 2024, marks a significant milestone as we commemorate the 10th anniversary of MIC. So it is in this spirit of celebration that today we're showcasing the research of our MIC-affiliated faculty members. And as you will hear, these colleagues' work not only enriches academic discourse, but also holds profound implications for addressing the pressing issues of our time. So in that sense, then, this research forum is not just an event to celebrate our 10th anniversary. It is also a testament to the power of collaboration and dialogue. And it is a unique opportunity for us at MIC to engage with scholars worldwide, to share insights, and to learn from each other's experiences and expertise. So once again, thank you for joining our presentations and our discussions today. Now let me introduce our facilitators of the forum. Sam Sharma is Associate Professor and a Graduate Program Director in the program in Writing and Rhetoric at Stony Brook University. His work focuses on language and language policy and politics, cross-cultural rhetoric and communication, and international students and international education. Through international organizations, including the Society of Transnational Academics Researchers, known as STAR, he has gained very rich experience facilitating faculty training, research and teaching-based collaborations, and institutional exchanges across countries and continents. And on that note, let me take this opportunity to thank STAR, the Transnational Academic Researchers, for helping us publicize and promote today's event. Your collegiality is greatly appreciated. Our other facilitator, Chikako Nakamura, is a lecturer of Japanese language in the Department of Asian American Studies at Stony Brook University. She's also assistant to the MIC director. Her research interests include multilingualism, translation studies, Japanese literature, and online language teaching. And so with that, I will turn it over to Sam and Chikako, who will guide us through the forum today.
Thank you very much, Professor Ha. And welcome again, everybody. Hello. 6 brief and brilliant research presentations are integrated into the public forum that you will experience in the next 2 hours, which we have also designed to engage this diverse audience from across the disciplines and across the world by using interactive and discussion activities. So please get a cup of coffee or a glass of water, depending on your time and taste, plus pen and paper, and join us as an active participant in the discussion alongside the presentations. Let us begin with a fun interactive activity. In a few seconds, you'll see an interactive poll on your screen. The questions are easy to respond to with the click of a radio button each, but they're intriguing. And we encourage you to start taking notes even as you look at these questions and options. If something stands out to you or prompts a thought you want to share, do not hesitate to use the chat box, as well as saving your thought for discussion or question later on. Here is the poll in 1 second. Somehow it is not letting me pull that poll. It was yesterday. Chikako, can you make sure that I am a co-host so that my poll pulls up on the program account?
Yes.
Technology decides to give us a hard time when we're least expecting.
You are a co-host.
I'm a co-host?
Yes.
But it is not letting me pull the poll that we meticulously designed. It is asking me to create a new poll. So what I'll do is I will actually create a new poll and beat Zoom in about half an hour. For now, we'll have to skip and move forward with the first presentation.
Okay. Okay. Now it's time for a few brief presentations, and we will begin with Professor Joy Jansen. Professor Jansen is showing us how to do multilingual participatory research. Professor Jansen?
I'm unmuting. Let me share my screen. Is that working? Yes. Okay. So I'm here to talk about a project that's housed at the Center for Multilingual and Intercultural Communication. In this project, I and a group of interns, graduate and undergraduate students, are interviewing multilingual speakers on Stony Brook campus and recording their stories of language and life. So I want to start with the conclusion, if I may, if the screen will let me do that. And that is really the takeaway that I hope I can explain as clearly as I can, which is the process itself is of immense value, of listening, reflecting, learning. It's of immense value to all of us as scholars, as teachers, as students, in expanding our understanding of what it means to be multilingual and what it means to have a more linguistically just society. So process, I will keep coming back to that idea of process as I talk about this project. So where did we begin? We began at a point that I think is well known to everyone listening to me, and that is that language subordination is actively practiced in institutions of higher education. In Anglophone institutions, one language and one variety of that language is expected in academic settings. Faculty, students, staff who don't use that form can be silenced, can be discriminated against. So the unjustness of this situation is part of the impetus for the research, but also the fact that this hierarchy, this linguistic hierarchy, closes off, shuts down voices that would add to our scholarship, our knowledge, our understanding. This is another impetus for doing this research. So where do we start? To advocate for linguistic justice, we first need to know what we're advocating for. So nobody knows on the campus of Stony Brook how many languages are spoken or what the experiences of those speakers are. So we have been doing interviews, asking questions about language and identity, about good and bad experiences of using that language. And to come back to this issue of process, I want to say that the questions we started out with are not the questions that we're asking now. We are asking those questions, but we're asking many more. So the process itself, listening to each other, reflecting on what we've heard, has expanded our understanding of multilingualism and what we want to know about or from multilingual speakers. So to date, well over 250 interviews, over 40 languages, 2 academic years of data collection, and still ongoing. So as you can probably see, looking at this brief list, although the interviews are for the most part not very long, only 15 to 20 minutes, this is a massive amount of data. So what to do with this? So in weekly meetings of the research team, one of the things that has surprised me and others on the team is that there haven't been very many examples of overt hostility or prejudice expressed towards the participants in the research, the people being interviewed. And there are many reasons why they might not choose to talk about those events if that happened. But one question that I wanted to know was whether they were preemptively silencing themselves. Are they not experiencing discrimination because they're not using their languages? So to just get a handle on some of this data, to dive in, to find out if this is a valid question for inquiry, I looked at a small subset of the data, looking at some of these questions. How do speakers describe their experiences? What do they say about how others perceive them? That's a very important point. And are they potentially silencing themselves? So I looked at a small group of 7 students, all women, to avoid other factors that might influence language use. Traditional college age or university age, between 18 and 24. And also students who experienced all of their schooling in the United States. So we looked at a range of languages, Arabic, Chinese, 2 varieties of Chinese, Italian, Korean, Russian, Spanish, and Tagalog, and also a variety of physical appearances to see if that was a factor in the experiences these speakers had. So some emerging themes from this initial pass through the research, family guidance, that students were told by their families to speak English only. Discrimination prior to the university, and language ideology. So to give you just a little taste of what we hear in these interviews, here's a Russian speaker who's saying, my mom and my grandfather specifically did not teach me Russian because they did not like the associations of being an immigrant, for instance, or being Russian within the United States. My mom wanted to do everything in her power to distance me from the fact that I'm still a Russian citizen, but she really wanted to distance me from anything that wouldn't make me 100% American. And you can see that language ideology is clearly operating here. Americans are not speaking languages other than English. So in the theme or the category of prior discrimination, here's a Korean speaker who is talking about, I did experience some Americans who would make faces when I spoke Korean to my friends, and they would mock and in person with gibberish. So here again, Americans are not speaking languages other than English. And I should note that this speaker is American. She was born in this country. She's American. But she is categorizing Americans as being someone else. So here is language ideology revealing itself very openly. In elementary school, my teacher actually told me, she said, it's an English-speaking school. You shouldn't be speaking Mandarin. So it's clear, even from these very short excerpts, that all the participants, regardless of language background or physical presentation, had had past experiences that positioned them as outsiders. And to come back to this issue of process and talking about these preliminary results for the research team and going over these findings again and again, one of the other questions that I realized this research hadn't addressed as fully as it could was the issue of language insecurity. So this is a thread going through many of the interviews that participants, when speaking about the languages they grew up with, they expressed fear of the comments, the perceptions of their families, of their peers, in how they would use those languages. So language insecurity, self-silencing, a heritage of growing up in an English-dominant society. So you may be, I hope you're not, but you may be thinking to yourself, so what? Don't we know all this already? I would say, first of all, that to the best of my knowledge, there is no published research that looks at this broad spectrum of speakers in this particular setting. If any of you are familiar with research that does, I would be delighted to hear it in any language. So I will make that claim that I don't know of published research that has done this, but I would also come back to this critical issue of process and what all of us engaged in the project have learned about multilingualism, about ourselves as scholars and teachers by engaging in this process. So another thread of research, I have been collecting the reflections of interns involved in this project and trying to find out how they have changed over the course of listening carefully to other people and thinking about what they've heard. So I could talk a little bit about them, but let me talk about myself and my heightened attention to issues in the classroom that I was aware of, but perhaps didn't consider as deeply as I should, of commitment to languages, to using them, to going back to try to retrieve a language that I don't know very well. That's my plan for this summer intensive language study. That's certainly been an impact for me on this project. And I think we can see also changes in the participants, in people being interviewed anecdotally, renewed self-confidence in using languages, in using their language. And you could see this in the interviews also, that they will say sometimes, oh, I never thought of that before, when asked a question, for example, about language and gender use. So this process, this engaging in interviewing, in thinking, in reflecting and talking about multilingualism has been more meaningful than I can say. If I had the power to require everyone on the campus of Stony Brook to do this with us, I would. Because this in itself, I would argue, is part of the long-term goal of advocating for linguistic justice, of seeing how rich and beautiful and valuable multilingualism can be. So I could go on and on about this, and I would be delighted to with anyone who gets in touch with me with the center and wants to hear more about what we're doing and maybe the interview protocol. But I'd like to finish with, well, this is the takeaway, of course: interview, reflect, listen, lead others to do the same. I would like to finish with a brief excerpt from an interview that was done this semester, in which the participant said, I think the ability of speaking another language connects with more people, 100%. And I am in the process of wanting to learn new languages because I've seen the beauty of just, again, sparking a conversation. Like, it's just the most amazing thing. And people's eyes light up when you start speaking their native tongue to them, and they're like, oh, this is so refreshing. So refreshing, I think, is a lovely way to end a research presentation. So there we are, and thanks.
Thank you very much. I was actually able to recreate the poll, and we will pull that up for the audience to have a quick interactive activity. Launch. Please select take your time, about 3 minutes. Please select an option each. You can also skip the last few questions if you don't want to select any option, but hopefully we'll get a picture of a sense of our languages and our language diversity and dispositions. 3 minutes.
Yeah, I'm not able to put in answers. I don't know if I'm the only one.
No,
Maybe
it's not
it's
letting us.
letting the host and co-host. Our other colleagues, it looks like they're able to. It's just the host and co-host it didn't allow. It normally does that.
It's not allowing me either.
Yeah. We tried to make it, I don't know why. We tried to check the box that said allow co-hosts.
That's okay.
We'll do it later.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter.
And Chicago, we're going to share the questions in the chat box
Oh, okay.
so that colleagues can look at the questions along with information about the program for later reference.
Chikako, it appears that everyone has been able to complete the poll. It's just that we don't see it as co-hosts.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I don't think you need to put it into the chat. Yeah.
No, it is a different document that we're trying to share. We have 50. Let's close this in about 30 seconds. More. $55. $60. All right, let's look at this. Ready? All right. Let me share the result. I'll take about 30 seconds to highlight what we see. Lots of 2 and 3 languages in speech, lots of 2 and 3 languages in writing, some 5 or more. And when it comes to publishing, lots of 1s and a lot of 2, actually. This is wonderful. Sharing, even more. Look at that. It's equal number of people sharing their scholarship in English or in 1 and 2 languages, and some in 3 or 4. This is the beauty. The questions that we developed about language disposition are a little more challenging and complex. But this is something to think about. How can we move from suppressing languages toward promoting languages? Hopefully the questions themselves will prompt some conversation later on. I'm not going to go deeper than that. Thank you very much. You can look at the result yourself. I'll keep that open for a moment. The one response that inspires me the most is the last one. I take action to counter unfair and unjust effects of language ideologies and policies. Biggest number. All right, thank you very much. We are going to move on to the next presentation. 1 second. To the next presentation, let me introduce the speaker. Next, Professor Loredana Poletti is going to share how translation becomes a means as well as a locus for multilingual activity. Does translation erase difference, make it disappear, or do we use it for reappraisal of human diversity? What could an ethics of translation look like? Professor Poletti, the floor is yours.
Okay, let me share my screen first of all. Share, and you should now. Okay, you should now be able to see my screen. So thank you for that introduction, Sam. And I should say, first of all, that I'm so delighted to be here to celebrate MIC. I am a newcomer to the group, though not that recent any longer. I wasn't there at the start. But as someone who joined Stony Brook in the middle of the COVID pandemic about 3 years ago, I found a home amongst colleagues there. And so I want to celebrate that. And I want to celebrate also my students, our students, those fantastic students that Joy already spoke about, who with their diversity, linguistic and otherwise, and their enthusiasm, make our classes so interesting, so stimulating, and so relevant to our world day after day. So before I start talking about the research that I do, the questions that interest and sometimes agitate me, I want first of all to share some questions with you. Not a poll, nothing as complicated as that, but this is the sort of thing that I ask my students at the beginning of most of my courses. When you think I'm a specialist in translation, I'll say a little about how I came in particular, and having also an interest in multilingualism specifically. But my specialism is in translation and in the connection between translation and migration. So at the start of my courses, I often ask my students, okay, what's your idea of translation? What's your definition? What image do you associate with it? What kind of metaphor does the word for translation evoke in the languages that you speak? And how do you draw it? If we were in a classroom, I would be asking you now to pick up a piece of paper, pick up a pen, a pencil, maybe multiple colors, and draw your image for it. Now, you can't do that, but please feel free to add in the chat what your image for translation, your idea of translation is. And we'll come back to that at the end in a few minutes. So I said I'd start from my own path to multilingualism studies in particular. So I started years ago looking at the connection between translation and travel. And I always say, people used to say to me, okay, there's such disparate topics. How do you hold them together? But for me, the connection has always somehow been obvious. And even more so when I started thinking not so much about travel which is such a generic term, such a genteel term in a sense. But I started thinking about migration, about the forms of mobility that are pervasive in our world. Wherever we are in the world today, we see forms of mobility. And as people move, languages move, culture moves. And so for me, that is what took me also towards studies in multilingualism, was the relationship between translation and migration, but also was the relationship between translation and other forms of multilingual practices that we encounter in our world today. I should add, by the way, that I'm illustrating my talk with images of works of art by a number of artists and friends, in particular Filomena Coppola and B. Amore, who are themselves members of diasporic communities, in one case the Italian-American diaspora, in the other the Italian-Australian diaspora, and whose work really engages with ideas of migration and ideas of translation. So let me talk about how we can rethink the idea of translation. And as I said, please add in the chat. We'll see what you put there. But if I start with a traditional view of translation, so that word in English, translation, and the word that is used, or the words that are used in most Romance languages, traduction, for instance, in French, or traduzione in Italian, always have to do with something to do with transfer. And also at the heart of traditional views of translation, and this is still relevant, by the way, today, particularly relevant, I think, in the age of AI and in the age of the idea of automated translation, there's this idea of substitution, this idea of self-contained languages, self-contained spaces, nations usually, in which one language is associated with the standard, is associated with what people do or should speak. And then the idea of translation is transferring information, transferring data, transferring perhaps literature, traditions from one of those islands to another. And I do wonder, I'll take a look at the chat in a little while, but I do wonder if that idea, for instance, of bridges, bridging two islands is coming up in your comments about what the image of translation is. That image of islands is one of the most traditional, and it's based on that idea of a source text and a target text, a source language and a target language, a source culture and a target culture, as if these were self-contained, enclosed, and associated with rigid borders. Together with that idea of transfer between islands, let's say, there is this idea of substitution. You take one text, you substitute it with another, which after a while I started feeling quite uncomfortable with, because it implies some kind of erasure. You replace and you displace sort of something, you substitute it with something else. There's also associated with this idea of translation a notion of perfection. And the moment you put perfection into the picture, you're also doomed to failure. How many times have you heard the idea that translation is impossible, that things are untranslatable, that translation is a form of loss or a form of unfaithfulness? So with all of that, go also ideas of bordering, precisely as if we were contained by languages, by one language. We've just demonstrated in that poll that in this community, but in the society at large around us, Joy showed us with those interviews with the students at Stony Brook, languages are much more intricately woven together. Bordering can also bring to forms of censorship. Often people think of translation as the good guy who brings communication between different communities. But with that operation, there's also the potential to censor, the potential to regulate what can and what cannot enter a particular space, a linguistic space. There are also forms of appropriation, forms of control attached with that idea. These works of art, by the way, these wonderful embroidered works of art by Filomena Coppola, I'm going to show you, I've shown you the recto of them, but now I'm going to show you the other side, the verso. What if we think about translation differently? I want to think about translation as a form of continuity, as a way in which we inscribe our memory of who we were, of where our communities came from, of the narratives that have taken us where we are and possibly that are building our future. And that's where thinking of translation in connection with migration took me, because, as I was saying, translation often happens when people move and they take their languages, their cultures with them, but then they start interweaving, as we all do, as many of us in this meeting today have done and continue to do in our lives. We start interweaving our identities, our memories, our stories, the languages we speak. And so can we look at this from the other side? Look at the labor that goes into that, but look at also how translation can become a way of not leaving behind, but precisely interweaving and bringing with us, maintaining a co-presence of who we were and who we are, where our families, perhaps, our heritage came from, and where we feel we belong today. And so this idea of trace, not so much as tracing back some form of authenticity, but tracing the journey that we undertake and that our languages take with us, brought me to a different awareness of translation, and also of thinking of translation not, for instance, as an alternative or as a in contrast to multilingual practices such as translanguaging, but rather as a continuum which forms this translational fabric of our lives. And I love the verses, the back of these works by Filomena, because you see those messy at times, but wonderfully interwoven threads. So to return to those questions, and I see there are elements in the chat. So people are talking about curiosity, empathy, about traveling with empathy. People are talking about, let me look, yes, as waves. I love that idea too of waves, because waves go backwards and forwards and keep coming, by the way. So I tend to think now not so much of translation in terms of bridges or even in terms of mirrors, but in terms of threads, in terms of weaves, in terms of fabric. And yes, waves would also be a wonderful image. And one of the works of art that have inspired me the most and continue to make me think is this one by Filomena Coppola, where she used dirt and sand from the streets and the river of her hometown, Mildura in Australia, to build an intricate rug on the floor, and then invited people, in order to go and see that drawing on the far wall that you see there, to walk in, to walk through. And in walking through, of course, they traced, they somehow destroyed, impressed their own steps on the sand, but also created a new narrative about who we are and what our stories can become. And she said about that work that for her, it only came alive when people started to walk. I think this way of thinking about translation is also a reminder that each one of our steps has an impact, whether it's on the environment, the community, the people that we meet, the people that we teach, the students who work with us. So if you are interested in knowing more about this, well, there's a very large volume that I co-edited, which is a handbook of translation and migration with contributions, about 30 contributions from more than 40 scholars from all over the world that is coming out. And I've also noted here 2 declarations, one very recent, it's active now, if any of you wanted to sign it. It's from a European collective that promotes multilingualism in higher education in particular, and thinks about the impact. Sam asked us a series of questions. You can look at the MIC pages and see work that Sam and I and other colleagues did precisely around those topics of how to promote multilingualism in our own practices, in our own classrooms, even, dare I say it, as language teachers, against that logic of monolingualism that says, in this room, you leave all your other languages behind. So take a look at our pages on MIC, but I would also encourage you to look at the declaration from the ECSBM, and also it's a few years older now, but the Salzburg Statement for a Multilingual World. And I will finish with that and with an invitation to all of you to embrace multilingualism in our practices, to embrace a version of translation and of that language continuum that highlights languages, that highlights our awareness of languages, as Joy was encouraging us to do, and that doesn't leave us indifferent at any point to language. Thank you. I'll close it there, and I'll stop sharing. And thank you, Sam, for sharing the link to our MIC pages.
Thank you, Professor Polezzi. The next presentation is by Professors Ji-won Huang and Eriko Sato. Doctors Huang and Sato will discuss the focus of LOTE, language other than English teaching, should be on fostering individuals who can effectively and harmoniously engage across cultures and languages, leveraging their multilingual and intercultural competence.
Is everybody seeing the screen that I'm sharing?
Please share again.
Oh. How about now?
Yes, no.
I think I'm sharing the screen now. Do you see it?
Yep.
Okay, great. So hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us from all over the world. I was excited to see where you're, when I checked the chat, to see where you're all from. My name is Ji-won Huang. Today, my colleague, Dr. Eriko Sato, and I would like to talk about our language learning experiences. So we have talked about linguistic diversity on campus. We have also talked about translation. Now, as I have seen on the chat that, or in the poll, that a lot of us are actually bilingual or multilingual speakers, that let's try to pause a moment to think about our language learning experiences. So the question that I would like to ask you is, what is the role of language teaching and learning, especially languages other than English in higher education? So let's try to reflect on your own language learning experiences as we go through this. So let's begin. Have you noticed how our Gen Z students walk across campus? Anybody? You can leave your thoughts in the chat. Yes, some of them are engaged in conversation, of course, and some are sipping coffee. But it's also very, very easy to spot a number of zombies. Do you guys know what? Yeah, smartphone zombies, right? So our students now, when we meet them every day, they are digital natives, given that they have been managing social and mobile technology from such an early age. We wonder how these Gen Z students approach language learning. How about Asian language learners in the US, such as learners of Chinese, Japanese, or Korean? While these languages are generally considered to be difficult to learn, especially for speakers of English, the wide range of language learning tools, such as these, have made language learning convenient and fun, especially for younger generations. I'm sure some of you, or many of you, have used some of these tools, including myself. Secretly, I'm sharing my experience using Duolingo to learn Chinese. Yeah, they provide accessibility, bite-sized lessons, adaptive learning features, rewards, and puzzles and games. So it's really fun and engaging. However, these language learning tools typically focus on forms, grammar, and vocab. And at best, they might address communication skills through virtual tests with native speakers. Many learners are still chasing the goal of speaking like native speakers. It is a goal that is not only unrealistic, but also supports a false idea that there is only one correct way of speaking a language. And this undermines linguistic and cultural diversity within speech communities. The communication-only oriented approach views culture as a monolithic notion, primarily focusing on norms that are appropriate and acceptable with the mainstream communities where the language is spoken. And and it ignores the intercultural aspect of communication. So as we are moving beyond these approaches in our increasingly multilingual and multicultural societies, we face crucial questions. What should be the role of teaching languages other than English in the 21st century? And how can we help language learners develop into interculturally capable communicators who turn intercultural encounters to meaningful intercultural relationships? So in this interculturally oriented approach to language teaching, as Scarino points out, that learners are always navigating between their own linguistic and cultural worlds and those of the target language users. It's a dynamic process where learners start to decenter from their own social, linguistic, and cultural frameworks, leading them to new understandings of themselves and others. In other words, the goal in language teaching isn't just about what learners want to be able to do with the language, but also about who they want to become through language. So we believe that at the heart of this transformative experience is intercultural engagement. It's not just about learning a language, it's about opening doors to new worlds and perspectives. So let's revisit our Gen Z students. How are they engaging with target language worlds and cultures? Are they tapping into them through global media platforms or social media and on our internationalized campuses, where they can meet students from China, Japan, Korea, or any other places in the world? Are they making the most of these interactions? To get a real sense of how our Gen Z students experience language learning beyond the classroom, we followed learners of Chinese, Japanese, and Korean here on our campus in our first phase of the research. And as you can expect, many of our Gen Z learners indeed deeply engage with diverse target language pop culture media, and very, very frequently. So pop culture media turned out to be such a powerful learning tool for our students, culturally and linguistically authentic and useful for engaging students in critical thinking and self-reflection. However, students often tend to feel very insecure when interacting with native speakers of the target languages, probably because of this power imbalance that could happen in communication between native and non-native speakers. So despite a large number of target language speakers available on campus here at Stony Brook, students find it a bit hard to engage with them. So availability is not enough for engagement. So we needed to step in and help our students. In the next phase of our research, by finding out first what works and what doesn't work in our students' lives, we wanted to provide students with research-based support. So in our collaborative efforts, our researchers and instructors got together and we have reimagined again our language courses to better harness intercultural communicative resources. So our goal was to promote authentic, critical, and reflective intercultural engagement. And to achieve this goal, we've introduced a set of key activities which were designed to shift the focus from merely speaking a language fluently and without errors to making and negotiating meanings collaboratively during communication. So we have prioritized creating a safe space for students where they are supported through opportunities for critical reflections, practice that encourage decentering from one's own linguistic and cultural perspectives, engagements that emphasize authenticity in communication, and opportunities to discuss language ideologies, linguistic variation and diversity, and language learner identities. So we try to take a process-oriented approach here in our efforts. We view culture not as static or monolithic, but as dynamic and multifaceted. And this perspective reshapes how students interact with and understand cultural and linguistic elements within the language and learning process. And my colleague, Dr. Eriko Sato, will pick up from now.
Hi. So through our effort, we've already seen some benefits of our newly designed interculturally oriented language teaching. Through pair-up activities, students refined their ability to notice vital cues for culturally sensitive communicative interactions, including response tokens, repair strategies, sequencing practices, and discourse markers for expressing emotions or stances. They also improved their analytical skills and ability to synthesize interculturally sensitive communicative interactions. Through TA time, students literally collaborated to interact and to communicate, leveraging all of their linguistic and semiotic resources, including gestures and facial expressions. Within a few weeks, they built a supportive learning community. Through discussion forums, students increased self-awareness and empathy, embraced linguistic and cultural diversity, and recognized and overcame biases. Interculturally oriented language teaching can transform students into multilingual intercultural communicators, as we just saw. But to enable this transformation, we need to change our teaching practices for all respects. And these two illustrations were generated by ChatGPT using keywords traditional classroom for teaching Asian languages and interculturally oriented classroom for teaching Asian languages. Please compare. Obviously, the student seating is different, and the presence of teacher is different. The teacher is standing in front of everybody on the left, but where is the teacher? And the presence of the mixture of culture-specific materials is different. On the right, we see many like flags or books or culture-specific icons. But the important difference should not be the physical look of the classrooms. What we need to change are objectives of the courses, teaching methods and materials, assessment systems, and most importantly, teachers' stance and mindset. Teachers often prescribe standard language and a monolithic culture and promote cross-cultural activities rather than intercultural ones. Now what? Let's think about the impact of interculturally oriented rote teaching in higher education. Will it change the campus culture? How about our local community? Is it multilingual, multicultural? Is it inclusive? Can we do something about that? How about the dominant ideologies in our society? Is a monolingual ideology hindering inclusion? Let's think about it, then ask ourselves this question again. What should be the role of rote teaching, rote meaning language other than English, as you know, role of rote teaching in higher education in the 21st century, where the societies are highly globalized and English is serving as a lingua franca. In addition, let's think about how we can bridge the gap between researchers and practitioners. If you have some idea, please write them in the chat box. Jiwan and I are looking forward to reading them and learning from you. Thank you very much.
That was quite on time. We're actually doing very well on time, and it is now time for an activity for engaging everybody in this room. Get ready. Here's what we're going to do. We are going to ask you to take about 2 minutes to take notes on this question. That will help us to reflect on the last 3 presentations and on the overall idea of language diversity, language justice. How are your languages, identities, cultural, and knowledge resources affected as you move away from or into new contexts? The context and moving out or into them may be local or across national borders, or the moving could be moving in your language practices themselves, our language practice themselves, such as between or among languages. Let's reflect on these issues raised by these presentations and get ready to share some thoughts. First, we will ask you to take notes, and then we'll ask you to share some notes in the chat box, but we'll open up for some voice conversation. We have about 15 minutes. Again, we're doing really well on time, with time. I will put the question in the chat box. And your notes don't have to be limited to this question. You can write up a question, a thought, an idea, a note. This is an open discussion, but hopefully you will also ask questions of the last 3 presenters or build on their theme to share your own thoughts. When you're done thinking or writing, please share in the chat box. And if you'd like to start talking, raise your hand, please. Okay. Jilison, I think you had a hand. Are you able to unmute yourself?
I just unmuted him.
Okay.
Hi, Professor Sharma, am I audible?
Yes, go ahead. Take a minute.
Hi, all of you. Good evening. It's really last time in my last conversation, Professor Sharma corrected that term I used to use, often mind-boggling, and actually it is not mind-boggling; it is mind-blowing. It was that I often used to say this, and the topic itself very wonderful. Professor Palaji, your presentation made me go back to my own work. And Professor Sharma, here is the question that, especially today's presentation, is really making me think about my location as a teacher. How are your language, identities, cultural knowledge, resource affect you to move away from it? Basically, as a language teacher in Nepal, I teach in undergraduate students, bachelor first year, second year, and +2, where English is monolithic, where English is only taken as a means of traversing new world, opening up new avenues for further study. And other word, it is the way of undermining other languages subserviently. And this is one language. And second one is Nepali as a major language. That is also in some of the parlances, in some of the conversation, Professor, you have also raised this issue seriously about how language, one language dominates another one, even in regional context as well. For example, in Nepalese context, Nepali is taken as the main language and others are dominated. And leading to it, even in my family, as a teacher, I also, frankly speaking, did not encourage my children to study, to even speak and write and learn in their own language, rather they just do this one. So today's presentation made me think about it, get back. And Professor, once again, thank you for you, because you are the person who introduced in Nepalese context that, okay, research, language, knowledge production should be in local language and promote it. And this is what we have been doing. Thank you so much. And my take from this presentation, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. You're seeing a lot of wonderful comments on the side. Please continue to share your thoughts. Peggy, you had a really wonderful comment here. I think that moving from one country to another requires employing all your senses. Indeed.
Yeah, I think that's really important. You forget, you think it's only what you speak and what you hear, but not all the other things going around you.
Yeah.
We have someone who's raised their hand. I don't know if you can.
Gary, yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Sam, and all of you. Very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm from now Canada. So what I want to know is about that means, so the cultural language and this, so many multilingual, this phenomenon is one of the, a kind of identity only in my experiences, because if you know that things, this is a kind of entity of the country, entity of the nation, entity of the, states. And this also ensure that if I know my own language, I'm also belong to my kind of indigenous nationalities, Mogar. This is good for my nation, society, and the country. But in another thing is that, but to live better life, we must have to know the world language. That means English, maybe the French, maybe the Spanish, something like that. And to ensure to make the country identify, to make the country recognize, to make the nations or society or family recognize, we must have to speak our own language, because our parents, our ancestor, and my family don't understand that English and Spanish and French and other international languages. But the thing is that the whole scenario is especially depend on the financial ceremony, financial, a kind of the basement. That is why we must have to know the other language. So me come here, Dr. Sam also already came, US, and so many other, the philosopher also come in, and interchanging their society, their nation, their states, and their so many transformation with each other. Why you are teaching in Estonia, Brook University, and so many places. So this is the better thing, is that to make sure our own entity, we must have to follow our culture and language. But to make better life, we have to follow the worldwide languages. Thank you, sir.
To draw an inference from your comments, it seems the solution doesn't seem to be difficult. We just have to do it, which is don't give up, learn new languages, navigate the world, get benefit from connecting with the world, but don't kill, destroy, suppress your language in the name of education. The solution seems to be so simple, and yet it seems so difficult for many people to grasp.
Can I say something to that too, Sam? Because that what you just said, is really at the heart of what I was trying to say, which is that it's not a question of replacing one thing with another. The point, as Sam was saying, is to navigate, and as many has written in the comments, is to navigate this with all our senses, with all our heart and our intelligence, but not to feel that we have to give up what we are or what we were in order to. So that's where that question of substitution for me needs to be really, really set aside. But also, it's not enough to have a binary model. And again, it's important, and it's something that's come out, I think, in all the presentations already this morning. It's not just a question of, do you speak English or do you speak Nepali or Italian in my case, or Urdu or whatever it might be. I have wonderful students who walk into my classes and say, my identity has already gone through all these different points. You know, it's much, much more complex than that. It's not just a binary. And I think that refusing to be placed in that binary bind is also what we have to do. Not to say you're either this or this. We are much more than that.
Thank you, man. Thank you.
Isaac has a wonderful comment. Would you like to unpack if you want to?
Sure. So my comment has to do with adhering to the dominant monolingual ideology, not without resistance. There's definitely a lot of internal resistance, and at times even voicing concern. But because I often feel like I'm at the bottom of the totem pole. I'm a PhD student. I feel like the type of shifts that I can make aren't immediately tangible, or at least I can't see them immediately, and so I find myself trying to figure out, well, how do I promote multilingualism in this space without facing microaggressions, or if I do face microaggressions, how do I cope with that? So it's a lot to unpack.
Thank you. Those are real harsh realities. But Isaac, do you think that sometimes on the positive side, you also have certain recognitions, gains, right? Positive reinforcements. If you look at the other way and find opportunities, connections, resources, empowerment, right? Do you see positives as well as those microaggressions and other negatives too?
Of course, and I think about your writing boot camp, right? And I think about the spaces that you create and the spaces that exist on campus that certainly promote multilingualism and promote all of ourselves as researchers. And so I do actively seek those spaces, and I try to embed it back into my kind of academic bubble, my kind of small academic space. But it's that embedding these other welcoming spaces into a space that's not as welcoming that I still need to figure out.
Antonia, you have a...
Yes, yes. Hello from Ukraine. I do enjoy the discussions today and happy to be here. And just, I live in the very western part of Ukraine, which borders on Hungary, Poland, and Slovakia. And I want to say that Transcarpathia historically was the area that was under Austro-Hungary Empire. But just here, people who live, so the languages of minorities are easily communicated here, and just the schools where they are allowed to study in their languages. So the Czech language. So what I'm trying to say that for me, for instance, I speak four: English, Ukrainian, Russian, German, some Slovak, very little Polish. I feel truly enriched. Maybe because I'm a philologist, but at the same time, I feel that, for instance, English is my major. It's a way, it's a tool for, for finding ways to people, just it's not the language for the sake of language. Sometimes it's, this misunderstanding of a language class in schools. It still exists, for example, in Ukraine, why some people speak so few languages, right, for instance. But this is, again, it's, I don't feel that like I am somehow like restricted when I am jumping from the context to the context, but vice versa, when I'm just getting into the Italian language when I was a visiting scholar in Italy. So it was fantastic, to learn some words, to learn some expressions. So therefore I say that I would definitely say from the experience that I enjoy, looking into the words. And this is what I'm doing with my students, just sometimes coming into my classroom using some Spanish words, like I somehow used to start studying Spanish on my own. I guess this is fantastic because you become an active listener. Just you become an active listener. Just like a little experience. I am involved in one project of NGO, and we had a session, and we used the Polish, the Czech, the Slovak, and the Ukrainian language for communicating during one session. Can you imagine? Each person, of course, these languages are close. They do not belong to the German group of languages, but the Slavic. And it was fantastic. So we had posters with the main vocabulary of the project, and it was so great to compare, all the glossary of the active vocabulary just that we were making use during our session. So this is truly fantastic, and thank you so much for raising this issue. So I am enjoying the session today.
Thank you for joining us, and thank you for sharing your experiences. We have a little bit more time. We have 2 more minutes. Somebody please volunteer. Presenters, would you like to follow up? Yes.
Is it okay to talk a little bit?
Yes.
So today's discussion, we talked about translation, which is not singular, which is multiple and interconnected and complex, like Loredana talked about. And in this society, like for certain things, relying on just one specific translation could cause a misunderstanding, like some ideologies, some view of someone else's culture, people rights, and then if we just look at only one translation or interpretation of someone's culture, this could lead to a very wrong ideas and then escalate discrimination, so on. And it's very important. Of course, English is convenient and facilitates our global communication, but everybody should make effort to learn, like not only heritage languages, but someone else's language, 1, 2, 3, through looking at the language, experiencing the sounds and the sensitive meanings, multiple meanings hidden in one word. The students or learners can discover so much. And this is very effective to solving some misconceptions or stereotypes and so on. Nowadays, we don't have to become like a native for many languages, but even though we just learn a little bit, that the impact is huge. And then I think anyone should try our best to experience multiple languages.
Thank
That's
you.
the connection, between translation and language learning.
Thank you very much. We have 3 brief and brilliant presentations, and then we have another discussion, 10 or 15 minutes. Of course, if you have to go to attend to something urgent, important, do. But otherwise, if you have the time, please stay with us. We're going to continue to engage you with, and after the 3 presentations. For now, let's take a 2 or 3 minute stretching break. Get a glass of water, stretch. Sitting down for too long is not good, but don't go away. Come back and we'll continue the conversation. It's going to be more and more fun. If there's a volunteer who can take us into a breathing or some other, break, feel free.
They should build some exercise breaks into this.
Okay. I'm not that big of a sort of expert or anything, but we can take a long breath. Like, let's count 10 long breaths, everybody. If you don't want to go away, sit here and do that. Loredana, I love how you connected the danger of a single story with language, because a single language is also sort of a single story.
A single story and a single voice. I tell all my students, you know what I tell my students at the end of the semester? I'm not here to tell you how to think about anything. But if anyone comes and tells you that there is only one right way, and then they proceed to tell you exactly which one because they know, just prove them wrong.
Yeah. In what unnatural, artificial world is only one language endorsed? The society doesn't look like it. The community, history, nothing looks like it. And when academia tries to enforce an artificial, contorted, monolingual world, it is nothing but injustice and counterproductive for learning and growing. All right, we are at the end of our break.
Okay, let us get into the second half of the program. The first presenter of the second part is Professor Sarah Jordan. Professor Jordan will talk about the inequity in world language teachers. Professor Jordan?
Thank you, Chikako. Shall I share my screen?
Yes, please.
Is this shared in full screen? Are you all able to see the screen?
Yes.
Wonderful. Wonderful. So, good morning, afternoon, and evening to everyone who is here. I would like to thank Chikako and Sam Sharma and Agnes for organizing this wonderful symposium, and to all of my colleagues with MIC who've enabled me and many of us here at Stony Brook to do some really interesting research in interculturality and in language learning and teaching. I would like to turn our attention for a few minutes towards the K-12 teaching situation. And we're going to talk a little bit about the K-12 teaching force in the United States, which here is disproportionately white and female. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. And I'd like to begin by asking you all to think about, and you can perhaps put in the chat, in your teaching context, whatever that might be, whether it's a high school or a college situation, whatever your setting is, do you have any idea what percentage of the teaching force is female in your setting? We're going to look specifically at the data for the US. What does the US teaching force look like? And our data is from 2020, 2021, specifically from the National Center for Education Statistics. That's the most recent data that's available nationwide. This is for US public schools teaching from kindergarten through 12th grade. So elementary school, middle school, and secondary school. And the graph that we see now shows the percentage of teachers who are female in these settings. So there are approximately 90% of the educators in elementary schools in US public schools who are female, slightly less of a percentage in secondary schools, so about 65%, but still quite high, certainly more than half. The overall percentage is about 75% when you combine these two groups. So 75% of the US public school teaching force is female. We can also look at the demographics of the teaching force compared to the demographics of the students. So again, from the same data source, here we have the percentage of teachers in public schools in the US, again, 2020 through 2021, percentage of teachers compared with percentage of students of various ethnicities. So the dark blue bars show the percentage of teachers of a particular ethnicity, and the purple bars show the percentage of students. And so we see that a disproportionate percentage of teachers in the US public school system are Caucasian, white, approximately 80%, compared to the percentage of students who are white. So our teaching force does not look like our students in the US public schools. Only approximately 45% of the students are white, whereas approximately 80% of the teachers are white. So this is quite a glaring disparity in the United States, and something that needs some attention. This is a summary of the data we just looked at. So 77% of the teachers were women, 80% of those white. Students, however, 46% are Caucasian, 28% Hispanic, 15% Black, and 5% Asian. When we look, so that's the overall teaching force. When we look specifically at world language teachers, which is what I want to focus on for the next few minutes, when we look specifically at world language teachers, again, we see approximately the same number are women. 78% of world language teachers are women. This squares with the data overall. There's a slightly higher percentage of world language teachers who are non-white, Hispanic, largely due to the fact that Spanish is the most taught language in the public schools as a world language in the public schools in the United States. So here we see a slightly better match between the ethnicities of the teachers and the ethnicities of the students, but it still doesn't exactly match the ethnicities of the students. And we also see a fairly low percentage of teachers who are Black, Asian, or of other ethnicities. So the questions are, why is the US K-12 teaching force, including world language teachers, disproportionately female? And why is the teaching force disproportionately white? So let's talk just a minute about questions of gender. In the US, teaching is often viewed as a low status profession. Teacher salaries tend to be quite low in the United States for K-12 teachers. This happens not to be true here on Long Island, but it is true in most of the other states in the United States. And there is a perception, certainly in the US, and perhaps less so in other countries, and that could be an interesting discussion point about both the status of teachers, how teachers are perceived, whether they're perceived as having high status or low status internationally as compared to within the United States. And then this perception that teaching is caregiving. That's a common perception in the United States, that teaching is caregiving, and that caregiving is primarily a female occupation. And therefore, more women tend to go into teaching than men. This was not always true. If we go back to before World War II, there was a much higher percentage of men who were teachers, particularly secondary school, high school teachers. And that changed with World War II. So the factors I've listed above contribute to this persistent imbalance in the percentage of women in the teaching profession in the US as opposed to men. So that's on the question of gender and why the teaching force in the US is perhaps predominantly female at the moment. We're also going to look at the question of ethnicity, race. So in the past 10 to 15 years, there have been some unintended consequences to changes in teacher preparation policies across much of the United States. There's been a rise in something called the EdTPA, the use of the EdTPA. EdTPA stands for Educator Teacher Performance Assessment, and it has been used as a very high stakes assessment of a candidate's readiness to enter the classroom, the K-12 classroom. And this may in fact have contributed to racial disparities in the teaching force. By high stakes assessment, I mean that this has been an assessment that's used to be a gatekeeper. Someone had to pass this assessment in order to be given certification to teach in the public schools. And of course, to teach in the public schools in the US, you must be certified by the state in which you live. If someone doesn't pass this assessment in many contexts, they were not issued certification, and as a consequence, could not become teachers in the K-12 public school system. So the use of this EdTPA had some really dire consequences on the teaching force, and in particular, the world language teaching force. So there was one large-scale study that was done in 2016 that found that Hispanic teacher candidates were more than 3 times more likely to fail this assessment, the EdTPA, than non-Hispanic white candidates. This particular study did not examine world language teacher candidates in particular, but some other and subsequent studies have. So Troyan and Kaplan in 2015, I did a study in 2018, and then I, with some of my colleagues, including Jiwan Wang, who you heard from earlier, and Eriko Sato, who you heard from earlier, and Peg Spitzer, who is on this Zoom, and Lilia Huizdebe, who might also be on this Zoom. We conducted a study, and so all of these studies found that non-native English speakers, in particular Hispanic teacher candidates, were disadvantaged on this particular assessment, which was a way to get into teaching in the United States. Just to give you a glimpse of some of the data, very tiny glimpse of a piece of the data, we had a cohort of students in 2014 through 16. It happened that 10 of our students were native or heritage Spanish speakers, Hispanic students. 10 of our students were non-native Spanish speakers. They were all 20 of them preparing to become teachers of Spanish, high school teachers of Spanish. Of those students, of the heritage Spanish speakers in that particular cohort, only 1 passed the EdTPA. 4 of them failed, and 5 of them didn't even submit it. They decided, they got to the end of the entire teacher preparation program, and they decided they weren't going to submit the EdTPA because they couldn't afford it, because they didn't feel like they were going to pass it, because they were made to believe that they couldn't become teachers. And so out of that group of 10 students, native and heritage Spanish speakers, Hispanic students, only 1 received certification and got into teaching, compared to the non-native Spanish speakers who were preparing to become Spanish teachers in that particular cohort. And this is a very limited data set. 6 of them passed the EdTPA, and none of them failed. 4 of those students also decided not to submit it. But what this shows us is of this very small segment of students, 1 out of 20 was a Hispanic teacher candidate preparing to teach Spanish who actually became certified to teach in the public schools. This is devastating for the world language teaching profession. We need more people who want to impart their native languages and cultures in our classrooms, not fewer of them. We should not be shutting them out of the teaching profession. So the summary of that is that fewer than 50% of the candidates completed the certification process due to a combination of non-submission and failure. And non-native English speakers were both less likely to submit, and once they submitted, more likely to fail the EdTPA than native English speakers. So this was a trend, a very disturbing trend for more than a decade. But I'm happy to report that recent changes in policies in New York State and other states have either eliminated or reduced the importance of this particular assessment, the EdTPA. There are still some others in place that are somewhat troubling, but the EdTPA's importance has been reduced. But now we need, and that's only been fairly recently, now we need to redouble our efforts in the US to break down barriers so that we can allow greater access to the teaching profession for future teachers of color, and encourage greater participation of men in our teaching profession to reduce this imbalance that we see in our profession. So I will stop sharing my screen now. Thank you all very much. And I am happy to entertain any questions. I could not see the chat while I was talking, so I apologize if there are questions I should address in the chat.
The chat has gone wild.
Let's see.
Indeed. Thank you very much. We will connect these issues from all three presentations in the second part in the open discussion. Let us go into the two more presentations. Let's hear now from Professor Susan Brennan. Dr. Brennan is sharing about a research on language bias and wrongful convictions. Based on an NSF-funded research traineeship, she will share about human-centered scientists and how human-centered scientists and data scientists apply computational techniques to promote human values and help uncover biases against wrongfully convicted non-native English speakers. The floor is yours.
Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I love this greeting. So thank you also for that wonderful database talk that we just heard. I'm a big data nerd. I'm Susan Brennan. I'm a cognitive scientist in the psychology department at Brook University, and I have affiliations in linguistics and computer science. I've known Agnes for decades, and I've collaborated with her and Chikako and Jiwan on a previous NSF research grant we had about communication in the global university between international teaching assistants and our mostly monolingual undergrads. And so now I'm going to be telling you about something quite different from that. This is about our recent and ongoing work in AI and data science. I think that many of us are all too kind of stunned by what's happened recently with artificial intelligence. And I wanted you to put into the chat how you feel about AI. Just to, you know, I'll probably keep on talking while you decide how you want to share your feelings about AI. You know, as you know, large language models, we call them LLMs, have ignited all kinds of changes to our teaching practices, our research toolkits, perhaps even our daily lives. Maybe someday they'll help level the playing field against forms of language bias that we suffer through in terms of suppressing people's linguistic variation, but maybe it'll make things worse. AI can go either way. So how do you feel about AI? Are you curious, excited, hopeful, afraid, empowered, or do you just feel, can I just retire now, which is what many of my colleagues are feeling right now? So put that into the chat as we move ahead. I want to just kind of ask you to think about, do you even know what AI is? I think most of us who are working with AI still can't even explain what is going on. People can build these systems, they can train it on unimaginable amounts of data, but even my colleagues in computer science can't really predict what's going to happen. And that's both exciting and scary for me. So if you ask what is a model, my favorite definition is an opinion embedded in math. Okay, this comes from Kathy O'Neill, who herself has a PhD in math. She wrote the best-selling book in 2015 or 16 called Weapons of Math Destruction. And that book opened many people's eyes to the fact that data-intensive machine learning, which is a form of AI, is very far from the unbiased tool that they originally thought it was. Just because it's a machine doesn't mean it's not biased. Basically, because it's been trained on unimaginable amounts of data, basically that brings with it all the biases that are embedded in human history, human institutions, have led to, you know, basically horrible practices like redlining in the loan business, property tax school funding, which kind of institutionalizes inequities in the public school system, healthcare algorithms that allow healthcare unfairly by insurance companies, LLMs that give racist medical advice, and even the Long Island highway system here at Stony Brook was designed by Robert Moses, who was trying to design it so that people from certain communities couldn't drive to the beach easily or get to the beach easily. So we are rife with bias that is related to data. And so this problem with unintended bias in AI has inspired our National Science Foundation funded traineeship, which is called Detecting and Addressing Bias in Data, Humans, and Institutions. Okay. And we're halfway along in this 5, or actually now 6, it's going to be a 6-year project. We're about to recruit our 3rd cohort of students. And so the training model looks like this. We've got, as you can see on the right, many students from psychology, many from computer science, and some from political science, linguistics, applied math, and statistics, economics, and 1 student in women's studies. Right now we have 24 trainees. And our model is, we have the kind of data science identifying students. These are from applied math and statistics and computer science on one side of the bridge. And on the other side of the bridge, we have the human-centered data scientists, people like psychologists, linguists, et cetera. And our goal is to provide a bridge for them to cross over so all of these students can learn to use AI in their toolkits, which increasingly is going to be a requirement for a research career. And we provide them with a number of advantages in order to get them there. And so I just want, so basically a lot of what I'm going to talk about now has come up in our convergent research practicum, where we kind of force these students to all work together across disciplines to try to detect bias in whatever field and whatever research topics they're working on. However, it's much harder to address the bias. And so that's some of the point of what I'll be presenting to you, okay? The problem basically is that data science and AI versions of that can really institutionalize bias in a very harmful way. And so I'm going to give you this quick example. And this isn't one of our projects. This is a project that inspired the whole training grant. It's a project by Julia Angwin of ProPublica, who found that bias in AI can unfairly predict recidivism, i.e. whether someone who's being released from prison will be likely to end up back in prison again. And this is sometimes used in decision-making in the incarceration system. And so there's an AI algorithm called the North Point Compass algorithm, and it was trained by unimaginable amounts of data to predict how likely it would be that someone arrested for an $80 misdemeanor would later on commit another crime in the next 2 years. And basically this is based on a questionnaire of over 100 different features. It is supposedly a race-blind questionnaire in that it does not record the race of the person who has been arrested. However, it includes that kind of information unwittingly because all of the other questions are correlated with the race of the incarcerated person. And so basically the example that they use in their article is these 2 petty thieveras, one a middle-aged white man who had previously committed armed robberies, and another one, a teenage girl, Brisha Borden, who basically stole a bicycle off someone's lawn because she wanted to go pick up her younger brother from school and was running late. And so with the data that Compass collects, Vernon Prater, the middle-aged white male, was deemed to be low risk. So the scale in this algorithm goes from 1 to 10, with 1 being the lowest risk. Whereas Brisha Borden, who only had prior juvenile misdemeanors, and often these are encounters with the law where the person really is just being over-policed. They may well be innocent. She was deemed to be high risk, okay? And so the interesting part is that 2 years later, Vernon Prater was in prison for another felony, whereas Brisha Borden never reoffended again. So we have a very bad prediction here. We have a big mistake made by North Point Compass. So you might ask yourself, is Compass fair? Well, because anecdotes like this are not data, let's look at the data. So if you look at the 7,000 or so cases from Broward County who was using this North Point Compass algorithm that Julia Angwin fought to get hold of using FOIA, or Freedom of Information Act, she found that, well, the error rates by race were about the same. And so the people who were selling North Point compass algorithm to law enforcement all over the place, argued, well, this is fair. There's parity here. There's really not much of a difference between a 63%, 64% and a 67% error rate. However, what Julia did with her colleagues was she audited this for what we call false positives and false negatives. Okay, so a false positive is when the algorithm says you're likely to recidivate or commit another crime, but you don't, okay? And a false negative would be when the algorithm says you are not likely to commit another crime, and it turns out that you do. And you can see that the distribution of errors, in terms of the ones favorable to the incarcerated person and the ones very, very negative to the incarcerated person, because you could imagine people using this to decide to keep someone in prison, are very different. And so you can see there's a huge amount of bias that is against the Black individuals that are in this database and favors the white individuals in the database. And this is true even though supposedly this algorithm is race blind. It does not include the overt factor of race in there. So that's the kind of example that really inspires my trainees and the faculty who are collaborating together on this. So essentially, data has two faces. The question is that we're faced with in our traineeship is how can we use data for the social good? And how can we find bias in both in real life and in human practices, and also in data, which is a reflection of that. And so data can be used obviously for good or for evil. For instance, the compass data in predicting whether someone should be released back into their neighborhood where many people are unemployed, maybe there's high crime, maybe they don't have very good social support. You can either think of an AI algorithm like Compass to be a risk scale that filters individuals by a notion of their risk to society, which of course you can see how unfair this is in the example I showed you plus the data. Or you can use it in a different way entirely as a needs scale. So you could imagine using it to determine how much support the institutions should provide to people once they are allowed to go back into their communities, okay? And so our trainees are very inspired to work in this space of criminal quote unquote justice and to try to see what they can do. And so I'm going to shift gears a little bit and just say that we've been working with people from the Innocence Network, which is a network of somewhere between 40 and 70 organizations, depending on how you count. I think it's at least 40 in the US. I think there are almost 70 worldwide right now. And these are organizations that work with getting innocent individuals out of prison. These are people who haven't stolen anything or haven't been fairly convicted at all. They are completely innocent. And so this slide comes from the recent conference in March, and I went there with several of our trainees. It's very inspiring. You can see that the group here consists mainly of lawyers and volunteers and data scientists and a lot of journalists who write about people's stories, and some people who themselves have been incarcerated. In fact, the head of this whole network is this woman right here who herself was incarcerated. And so basically within that network, there are many, many people who have been exonerated. And right now there's a database that contains over 3,500 of them. And this is basically exoneration since 1989. Together, these 3,500 individuals have lost more than almost 32,000 years of their lives. Some of them are in prison for 50 years before they can get out. And so this is really an inspiring data set. And again, for psychologists like me, it's big data. For computer scientists like my other colleagues, it's small data. But we're trying to use it to make predictions so that we can try to recognize patterns that might help these organizations figure out who they can help, okay? And so you can see here that I've blocked out the last names. This is public-facing data, though. You can see it if you kind of fill out the form to apply to the NRE. And you can see basically you've got all of these features about individuals, and each of them are marked with why their case was derailed, why they ended up in prison unfairly. So you have examples like false or misleading forensic evidence right here. You have false confession in this column. That's very common. Mistaken witness identification in this column. Official misconduct, that's very common here. Perjury or false accusations, which is right here, and inadequate legal defense. So all of these 6 canonical factors tend to explain a lot of these very sad cases, okay? And so what's interesting about this is that the data that you can see in these 3,500 cases is just the tip of a very large and horrifying iceberg, basically. We know the people who have managed to, get help and managed to be exonerated. And again, that can take a decade. But there are so many more people that are currently still incarcerated. And these are the data that
my thyroid medicine.
These are the data we don't have access to. And so that is what our trainees are trying to figure out how to adjudicate. So to give you an example of how critical these dark data are, these are dark data because we don't know where to find them. There's no light we can shine on them just yet. These would be the data that the innocence organizations, the people they haven't been able to help yet, or the people who are in prison who have an inability to even reach out for help or communicate. So there's a whole lot going on here. It turns out that it's estimated that 4.1% of people on death row are estimated to be innocent.
Brennan, just reminding time. One more minute, please.
Okay. And so we want to use AI to look for patterns, okay? And what we do know, for instance, is that while Black people are 13.6% of the population, they're 53% of the NRE's exonerations. So we've done a project recently where we're creating a tool for innocence organizations to take the NRE data and compare the data that they're working with that are still in this dark part, and to try to help them predict based on pattern recognition whether they can help these individuals or not. And of course, my colleague Mackenzie Johnson, who I think is on here somewhere, is spearheading our efforts to look at how many people have been wrongfully convicted due to language bias. So again, these are dark cases. We don't have that as a field in the NRE, and we're using language models to explore the NRE stories, the large language models like ChatGPT and court proceedings. And so I have another example here that I'll keep in my slides if you want to look at it later. But basically, these are cases where people might be even given a translator who doesn't even speak the same language they speak. And there are also cultural practices that impede communication and fairness in a courtroom situation. And so this is very much a work in progress. And I just want to say thank you for listening. And here's a photo of our faculty collaborators and our first cohort of students here. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Brennan. That's such a horrifying data, but thank you for powerful, inspiring presentation. Now, Professor Shrida, our last presenter, will outline how the World English's paradigm best explains the humanistic dimensions of multilingualism and English as a global phenomenon, but also in traditionally multilingual societies, which have often been neglected by researchers. Professor Shrida?
You're on mute, it looks like.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you, Chikako-san. Thank you, Shyam. Thank you, Agnes, for organizing this very nice seminar, a faculty seminar series. I have been working on multilingualism for a long time, and in relation to World Englishes, that's what I would like to talk about today. And May I share my screen, please?
Yes.
Yes, please.
Okay. So can you see this? Can you see my slide?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So let me see. How do I go to the next one? Okay. So here, there have been several presentations this morning that lead up to the kinds of things that I'm going to talk about and that draw upon the kinds of things they have talked about. And in the latest one is the one that Professor Brennan made, the one about what is the role of language bias in this whole process of the way in which we look at innocence or guilt and so on. But if you look at it in a larger scale, in terms of how we react to language in general, and about accent in particular, and about accented Englishes in particular, the whole idea of world Englishes comes in. And multilingualism, of course, involves use of more than one language for everyday use. And world Englishes in particular involves multilingualism. Multilingualism is central to world Englishes, and that's what I would like to talk about today. So let's start with the proposition that the majority of users of English in the world today are non-native speakers. And one second, yeah. And that is, majority of English speakers are multilinguals. For the first time, English is a language, for the first time, the case of English shows that a language has more non-native speakers than native speakers. And also, for the first time, such a contact language around the world has an unprecedented range of functional and cultural diversity, because it includes, let us say, Africa and Asia and Europe and Latin America and so on, the whole world, in other words. So how do we talk about multilingualism involving English and the problems that these things arise, that arise from this? How do we structure this? The best structure so far presented so far, and it has been very popular for the last 50 years, has been the notion of 3 circles of English. That is, talking about the speakers of English in terms of the inner circle, that is native speakers of English, as in America, England, Australia, Canada, South Africa, etc. And the outer circle, that is second language speakers, not foreign language, but second language speakers, where English has an internal role within the country, like as an official language or language of education or whatever. As in India and South Asia, and I noticed that there is a large number of South Asian participants in this seminar today, Nepal, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, etc. And Southeast Asia, that is Singapore, Malaysia, etc., and Hong Kong, the Philippines, East Africa, West Africa, and so on and so forth. The outer circle is a very large circle. And then the expanding circle, he calls it, where English is used as a foreign language. It may not have too much of an internal use, but nevertheless, it is used to contact and communicate with people in other countries. And so, let me now go to the next slide. Okay, so we need to ask ourselves this question: how English is used in the world today? And we notice that, first of all, the majority of the users are second language speakers. I just talked about that. And the majority themselves are non-natives, but they use English to speak to other non-native speakers. I will come back to the prototype of the kinds of communication that was implied in textbooks and so on. And the reality is quite different, as we see. So English is primarily used by non-native speakers to communicate with other non-native speakers around the world. That's a very important point that we need to keep in mind. And they use English to talk not necessarily about English content, that is the whether in England or industrialization in America or whatever, but they talk about all kinds of things beyond those that are dreamed of in England and America. So about the cultural and social issues having to do with maybe Ukraine or Brazil or Korea and so on. So most speakers of English speak with an accent, and their grammar and vocabulary are also colored by their mother tongue, what used to be called interference from the mother tongue. And they frequently switch from English to other languages in the same situation. So it's not monolingual communication. And they glide in and out of English even within the same sentence or paragraph, what we call code mixing or code gliding. And also that the kind of English that is considered appropriate is not necessarily the King's English or the Queen's English or standard network English, as we call it in America, or standard native speaker of English. And those things are actually often inappropriate, and they elicit negative attitudes. And therefore, you need other Englishes, not just the native Englishes. And so, on the other hand, the teachers and textbooks use the wrong theories of multilingualism in the classroom. So, for example, they expect that languages be kept separate. No switching is allowed, no mixing is allowed, no accent is allowed, no borrowing, no influence, and so on. Students are actually punished or penalized for using the mother tongue in a second language classroom. And the mother tongue influence is often considered interference. And the teachers themselves are not allowed to use the students' mother tongues, although using an equivalent, translation equivalent from the mother tongue might be much more efficient than giving a long explanation. And the teachers expect native-like performance from students from the start to finish. So errors are to be eliminated. Since most second language learners never attain native-like performance, what does this mean? Are most of the second language learners failed learners? So students are made to feel ashamed of their accents and the interference if they don't speak like a native speaker. So demeaning terms such as interlanguage, fossilization, and so on are used to describe these second language varieties. So this is where the paradigm of world Englishes comes in. Notice the plural in this, Englishes. The paradigm has revolutionized the English language teaching establishment. It challenges the concept of a single standard of the second language as appropriate for the whole world. It demands that we recognize the pluralistic nature of how English is used differently around the world. It questions the hegemony of the native speaker of English as the only standard or target that's appropriate for teaching or use. It educates the teachers to be on guard against implied discrimination against non-native speakers or people who speak with an accent. It demands recognition of non-native varieties of English as legitimate varieties, because first, it is natural for the mother tongue to influence the other tongue. Secondly, non-native contexts are used quite differently than native varieties. Non-native varieties are, sorry, there is a mistake. Non-native varieties are used quite differently than native varieties. They are used, the traditional paradigm was that a second language is used by students to talk to native speakers of the language. However, we now see that the second language is used by second language speakers to speak to other second or foreign language speakers. So they express different cultural and social content, often unique to their context. They're also used mainly to communicate with other non-native speakers. And therefore, what you really need is a realistic model of bilingualism. And that is why our Center for Multilingualism becomes important, because we are talking about what kind of multilingualism is real, what is appropriate, and what is to be used. So traditionally, multilingual societies have a lot to offer in this respect. For example, they have known, and in fact, scholars who have specialized in multilingualism, like François Grosjean, have talked about this. A second language is not needed for everything. It's only needed for a part of the lives of the second language user. The person has the first language for other things. In other words, what you need is a partial competence in the second language. The second language user and the user's second language and the user's other tongues, like the first language and third language and so on, together constitute the communicative success that the person aims at. Bilingualism is a composite of partial and complementary competences. It's not duplication of native-like complete competence. Accents and first language influence are expected and accepted. They should not be punished as interference. The other languages complement English. And also, when you look at around the world, multilingualism is a climb. There is a range of competences. Some people learn a second language as much as they need. Everybody doesn't have to be a researcher or a speaker of King's English. Every learner does not need full competence. Partial competence is the norm.
Professor Sridhar, a time reminder, 1 more minute, please.
Yeah, I'm done almost. So, in fact, when you look at it, which is the country with the largest number of English speakers or users? Which is the region with the largest number of English users? So even if you count only 25% of the population as people who use English, there is 350 million users of English in India alone, much larger than the United States, and about 500 million people in South Asia. And these people use English either by itself in the unilingual mode or with other languages in a multilingual mode, going in and out of languages. In all of these modes, the other languages, each language influences the other. And this results in non-native varieties of English. And so, putting all of these together now, what are the takeaways? We need to recognize the pluricentric nature of English, that there is not one center, but it's used for many things by many purposes in many ways. We need to realize that the native speaker norm is neither necessary nor appropriate in many cases in second language teaching. We need to replace prescriptive methods with socially realistic theories of multilingualism. We need to redesign teacher training curricula, textbooks, and teaching to accept a more realistic notion of how language works in multilingual societies. We need to recognize the hidden or not so hidden biases and discrimination that is based on wrong expectations about what it means to be a second language speaker and who it is used with and what it is used for. And finally, we notice how the World English's paradigm incorporates notions of equity, diversity, and inclusion that we have been talking about lately in American universities, and how it avoids discrimination. Thank you, and I look forward to a discussion.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. We are really doing well on time, maybe a few minutes late, but we do have another 20 or so minutes to wrap up. So Would like to engage everyone in reflection this time, as well as questions for the speakers, asking you what you are taking away from today's presentations and discussion. Think about one concrete idea that you would like to take away into your scholarship, into your teaching, into your community. Or it may be a question you will continue to ask. It could be an inspiration. It could be a perspective. Maybe, again, let's go back to taking a few notes, because notes tend to stay better than simply thinking. So let's take notes, 1 minute, and then we'll use the chat box, and then we'll use voice. Here is the question, if you'd like to start with a prompt. How can we leverage our language resources to create a more inclusive and just world? What is one strategy or idea you're taking away from today's conversation, or something you'd like to share or ask? Take notes, 2 minutes, and then we'll use chat and voice. Okay, please share your thoughts in the chat box. What are you taking away today, or what questions do you have for our presenters? There's a hand, Usa.
Yeah, hi everybody. I think it's very important to educate our students, because sometimes creating this awareness, because people come to the international students, they come to the UK. So I'm here at Dundee University in Scotland, and they are thinking that their mother tongue is second grade or something, and even in the families they have been brought up, they think that the ultimate aim is to speak like the native speaker. So when you have that mindset, then it's very difficult for them to, because at home also they've said don't speak in English. I remember when I went to for my first interview, Montessori interview, when I was 3 years of age, like something like pre-KG, I was told you have to speak only in English, and only then you will be able to get into a convent school. So my parents used to penalize me if I've not get that standard. So that creating that kind of awareness that this native speaker kind of thing is not what we need to be aiming for. So that's something that we need to learn. We need to take on that onus, because as faculty, we all know that, and we are learning from each other. But how do we translate that into the classroom is, first of all, helping them to unlearn what they've already learned, I think, and that's very important. And all the presentations were excellent. Thank you for all the organizers and for everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Other colleagues? continue to chat, and please raise your hand and share your thoughts, ask your questions.
While people think, can I say something to
Yes.
Usha's comment? And that is, you know, I teach so many students who are heritage students of one language or another. And it's interesting what you say, because what I see in them is histories where perhaps they were never taught the heritage language because of those mechanisms of aspirational mechanisms attached to English, or because of the fear of families, as we've heard before, that they might be shamed. But what I hear in them now are instead forms of regret. And sometimes even when they use the word shame, they talk about the shame for not having maintained those links, for not having kept enough of that connection. And so I think that's an important message we can give to families as well, and to our own students, that the regret that comes more from loss rather than from the choice of being the richness that we are.
Thank you. Ella?
Yes, I guess I want to thank all of you. This has been just absolutely as I would say, what the doctor ordered at the end of the semester. For me, I think I realized in these 2 hours or so that I'd like to be more deliberate, and also I'm trying to find the word in English, and I haven't been able to find it. So
that's normal.
I don't think
there's like that.
But I would say more deliberate, and maybe I'm going to use a word that I don't think captures it, but maybe more modest in in how to leverage the resources. For a more linguistically just world. I think often we come to these, and I've seen it in the chat function. We come to this work wanting to grand gestures and sweeping numbers, but I think the quietness of the work that we do, amplifying that quietness, looking at the small moments, small opportunities we have to consider and to shift the perspective and the practice of one student, of a classroom exchange, of a classroom encounter, of a discussion with a colleague. And so I feel that all of the different interventions have inspired, have awoken me, have challenged me, and have transformed me to think of the plurality of experiences, of ways in which we can leverage this work. But I guess want to end on something that it also helped me do, and I want to thank everybody here. Because I've been exhausted a little bit this semester, and it has recommitted me to the idea that I think, I do my work from, and Sam, I think you and Agnes and Joy and other people who know me here know that I take a rights-based approach to this work. I see it as human right, and therefore a responsibility. And so for me, it's pushed me. I sometimes, quiet that rights-based voice. And so today, thanks to all of you, I feel the urge to shout it from the mountaintops and to send out my, to once again send out my human rights declaration and circle, the ones, our right to our language, because ultimately our right to our language is our right to ourselves, to our authentic selves. And so thank you. I'm really inspired, and I hope that you will share the slides and the recording.
We will. We'll ask the presenter to share it if they would like to share, and then we'll put them all in the follow-up email.
Muchas gracias.
One or two more. We have some time, and then we'll ask Professor Ha to summarize or thank everybody. We have some more time. Go ahead.
May I say something?
Yes.
I think the discussions on the chat box, as well as all the presentations, point out some very important ideas about what it means to be a human being, what it means to be a decent human being in the world, and especially in a globalized world. So you don't have to give up your mother tongue in order to succeed in the world, to do well with the second language and so on, and how these two things don't have to be kept in hermetically sealed, compartmentalized ways. They do interact and enrich each other. And in fact, the successful person these days is, and in fact, it has always been the case, but especially these days, is a person who can bring in, who can remain himself or herself true to their culture and add on things that help them in whether it is engineering or computer science or medicine or whatever. So success in with a world language combined with rootedness in one's own languages and using both of them or all of them to enrich each other. And so that kind of a composite personality is appropriate for the global citizen today. And bilingualism is the ideal way to support that. And it has always been diverse, pluralistic, inclusive, and that's the kind of vision that we should promote in our language teaching and learning as well.
Thank you.
I wonder if I could say something quickly, and that is really the importance of community, of being present in situations like this, but interacting. I've learned a lot in listening to colleagues today, and I think we can all. There's always more to be learned about multilingualism, about teaching and research practice, and the support of a community is so critical in maintaining that broadening perspective. So I don't know if this is too early to do this, but I did just want to thank Agnes so much for starting the center and enabling us to be here today, wherever we are, and hearing each other and listening and learning. So thanks.
Thank you so much. We could end a few minutes early, let everybody go out and enjoy the sun or the night. Unless somebody wants to go ahead and share another thought. What are you taking away? What's one thing that you'll remember and try to... I see the president of Star Scholar Network. Thank you, Dr. Gowdy, for helping us to reach out to people around the world. Do you want to take a minute?
Yeah, Professor Sharma, thank you so much. This is amazing. I am filled with joy to see such distinguished gathering here. Friends, well, I'm privileged to bring 17,000 greetings to this amazing occasion. I'm really honored to be part of this remarkable event that you put together, celebrating the 10th anniversary of Faculty Research Forum at the Center for Multicultural and Intercultural Communication, Multilingual and Intercultural Communication. It's a milestone that not only marks the decade of pioneering research and collaboration, but also shines a beacon on the importance of our collective endeavor to understand and facilitate multilingualism and intercultural dialogue in our increasingly interwoven world. The Center's unwavering commitment over the past 10 years serves as a testament to the transformative power of academia when it bridges gaps, connects cultures, and fosters an inclusive dialogue on a global scale. Today, we are gathered to celebrate this distinguished achievement. I joined late, but the first thing I heard was, what makes a good human being? Mm-hmm. And some quite familiar faces brought a smile to me, and then I heard the idea of community building. So I'm sure the audience is now filled with the wealth of insights and perspectives that emerge from the conversations. The theme of the forum is quite relevant focusing on fostering dialogue and sharing research in multilingualism and intercultural communication. It is never, ever more pertinent than today. So in a world teeming with complexities and challenges, it is this very dialogue that paves the way for understanding, empathy, and ultimately progress. So I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to Professor Agnes He and the dedicated team at the Center for orchestrating this forum. Thank you. Professor Sarma is my longtime friend and mentor. I have been following the scholarship of Professor Nakamura. Thank you so much for inviting me today. Your efforts in bringing us together to celebrate, reflect, and envision the path forward are truly commendable. In closing, I express my sincere gratitude for the collaborative initiative that are stemming out of this event.
Thank you.
Let us seize this opportunity to learn from one another, to inspire and be inspired, and to carry forward the mission of the center into the next decade and beyond. Thank you for the privilege of being part of this journey. And here's to the continuous pursuit of knowledge, understanding, and interconnectedness in the diverse world. And I invite you to join the Star Scholars Network and maybe consider coming to Kathmandu for our next global conference in December. Thank you very much.
I'll share the link to Star Scholars Network on the side. I think we can move on to the final.
Okay, finally, we'd like to ask Professor He, Agnes He, Director of MIC, to say a few words by way of thanking the audience and the presenters.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Gowley, for your warm congratulations, and also thank you for your collegiality and cooperation. We enjoy working with you, and I look forward to more opportunities of collaboration in the future. Well, a lot has happened this morning. I feel like I know my colleagues, I know what they do, but every time I listen to them, I feel like I'm listening to them for the first time. I feel so inspired and so lifted, and I learn so much every time they speak. So first of all, may I invite everybody to give our presenters a big hand. Thank you for the work that they do. Thank you for sharing your insights and experience and your vision with the community at large on a global scale. Thank you, everyone. I would also like to thank our audience for your participation. Collectively, our diverse perspectives would add great depth and breadth to our exploration. So in the next couple of minutes, I will talk about my own takeaways, and I hope that my takeaways will have some relevance and resonance to everybody here. So this morning, we have explored a very wide range of topics that is crucial to understanding the language dynamics in today's world. Joy's work reminded us how important it is to recognize and to respect the language needs and language rights of multilingual speakers on college campuses. And additionally, the transformative nature and the transformative power of doing these kinds of participatory research for the researchers themselves, right? And that's the whole purpose of doing research, is we want to bring about a difference to the world. And that includes not only where we are, our own research participants, but ourselves as well. From Loredana, we learned that we can think about translation in a very new and fascinating ways, not just as a kind of solution or a strategy to fix a problem in language barriers. As you can use Google Translate to solve a problem if you don't understand something. But Loredana is saying that translation can itself be an analytic lens through which we can explore and appreciate the richness, the complexity, and the pluralism of our beautiful world, although it can be very messy, right? Jiwan and Erico focus on language education, and they're saying we got to shift our focus from a exclusive emphasis on native-like accuracy, native speaker-like accuracy, to expanding our learners' identity and cultural options, and so that we can enable our language learners to become interculturally competent global citizens, right? That is a very new way of thinking about language learning and language education. And Erico emphasized how this shift of focus, how can this shift of focus in language education positively impact our society and our community at large beyond the realm of language education, right? This is very important questions. Sarah looks at the teaching force in K through 12, focusing on gender and race. So my takeaway is that access and equity in the language teaching force, in fact, directly impact the conditions and the possibilities for our students to build multilingual and multicultural, not only capacities, but also their imaginations, right? What is possible in this world? So the kind of teaching forces have a direct impact on our students' imagination. Our students are the citizens of they are the future, right? So it is of a quintessential important issue for us to examine. Susan, I have great respect and esteem for Susan's work, whose work is always very complex and very challenging and very important and significant. So Susan talks about whether the data is small or big, depending on which disciplinary background that you come from. I would like to add that we also want to look at whether the data are deep and socially significant, right? Not only just big and small. That has something to do with me being a qualitative researcher. So we know that language has then a direct impact on literally lives and livelihoods. I mean, we're talking about whether we convict this person or not convict this person, and partly on the basis of how this person is presented linguistically, communicatively, right? So some languages or some accents or some patterns, some norms of communication are often deemed as more credible, more honest, or even more likable. And that has a lot to do with how we come to judge a person or groups of people. And that is, in the legal context, it has very important, both symbolic and practical ramifications. And that is a nice segue to Sridhar's discussion of world Englishes, right? So, Sridhar reminded us that the use of English as a so-called lingua franca for contemporary purposes, gave us compelling reasons to be thinking about language and justice in new and important ways, right? But at the same time, he also reminded us that there's a lot that we can draw from our past wisdom. So multilingualism is not anything that is new. It's not that all of a sudden now we are, with globalization, immigration, where we're confronting the challenges of multilingualism. Multilingualism has been with us for as long as humanity has existed. So there has been a lot of successful experiences and past wisdom from diverse cultural origins that we can draw from, right? And this is something that for which I thank Sridhar, for reminding us that at the same time as we're anticipating the future with the AI and all, and social media and digitization, let us not forget about our past wisdom and also the wisdom from a plurality of cultural sources, right? of course, there's a much more work to be done, as our audience member, Isaac, I think Isaac Rodriguez pointed out, right? There's also these challenges, how do we operationalize these kinds of great ideas, these kinds of concepts, and how do we manage and cope with the specific challenges on a moment-by-moment basis, on a daily basis, in our everyday encounters. So I think, we should be thinking about developing a sequel to this forum. We should have a forum number 2. I hope not in another 10 years. I hope sooner than 10 years later, but we should definitely be planning to do that. So with that, I would say that as we conclude this forum today, let me again say thank you for the engagement and enthusiasm of our audience members. And I would also like to welcome everyone to browse our center website, where you're going to find our resource page for linguistic justice in higher education, our MIC lecture series, our workshop series, and our interview series. There's a wealth of information and resources out there on our webpage. And I would also like to hear from you, from everybody, and we would be very grateful if you could share with us the resources that you have developed or are developing. So in a nutshell, we look forward to continued dialogue and collaboration and mutual engagement, so that we can strive to foster effective and equitable communication across linguistic and cultural boundaries. Thank you so very much.
Thank you. And thank you, everybody. I guess that wraps up our discussion today. Thank you for joining. We will keep the room open for a few informal minutes, but I'll stop the recording.